They say cedar is the best wood for a final resting place because it resists the rot. But all I could smell as I clawed at the velvet lining was the stench of my own terror and the metallic tang of the sedative still coursing through my veins. A man spends his life building things to last, putting his sweat and his soul into foundations that are meant to outlive him. But you never think about the strength of the walls when they're closing in on you from 6 inches away. My name is Arthur Vance, and I spent 50 years building the skyline of this city with my own 2 hands. I know the strength of timber. I know the specific sharp groan of a joist under pressure. I know the sound of a nail finding its home. And as the first blow of the hammer struck the lid of the box, vibrating through my skull like a funeral bell, I realized that my son, Marcus, wasn't just burying a body. He was burying a witness. The darkness was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed against my chest. My lungs burned for air that wasn't there, and every time I tried to scream, the only thing that came out was a dry, raspy wheeze. My mind kept flickering back to the dinner. It was supposed to be a celebration. 75 years on this earth, and I thought I was surrounded by love. Marcus had stood up at the head of the table, the light from the chandelier reflecting in his eyes while he held up a glass of the vintage red I'd been saving for a special occasion. "To your health, Dad," Marcus had said. He didn't look me in the eye when he said it. He looked at the wine. He looked at the table. He looked anywhere but at the man who had paid for the suit he was wearing. "You've worked hard enough. It's time for you to let us take the weight off your shoulders." Sarah had been hovering in the doorway, her arms crossed, watching me with the cold, detached interest of a vulture waiting for a heart to stop beating. I remember the bitterness of that last sip. I remember the way the room began to tilt, the faces of my family blurring into pale, unrecognizable smears of light. The last thing I felt was Marcus catching me as I fell, his grip too tight, his breath hot against my ear as he leaned down. "It's time to rest, old man," he had whispered. "You're just a ghost in this house now anyway." Then came the waking, the cold, the confined space, and that rhythmic, soul-crushing sound. Bang, bang, bang. "Is he finally quiet?" Sarah's voice drifted through the wood.
She sounded muffled, but the sharp edge of her impatience cut right through the cedar. "I can still hear the scratching, Marcus. It's making my skin crawl." "The sedative should have kept him out until the air ran out," Marcus replied. I could hear the grunt of effort with every strike of the hammer, the wood vibrating against the back of my head. I don't know why his heart is still ticking. The old man's heart is stubborn, I guess. "I told you we should have used the pillow, Sarah. It would have been cleaner." "No," Sarah hissed, and I could almost see her pacing the concrete floor of the cellar. "A pillow leaves marks, fibers in the lungs, bruising on the neck. The doctor is on the payroll, Marcus, but he's not a fool. He needs to be able to sign that certificate without looking over his shoulder. A sudden heart failure in his sleep, a quick burial in the old basement vault. No one will ask questions once the house is sold and the papers are filed." I lay there, my fingers bleeding as I searched for a flaw in the construction. I built this house, every brick, every beam, every hidden corner. I built the secret cold cellar in the basement to store Martha's preserves 40 years ago, when we thought we'd be growing old together in the garden. Marcus was using my own craftsmanship as my tomb. He was using the very stones I laid to hide the evidence of his greed. But Marcus was always a sloppy builder. He liked the prestige of the job, but hated the labor. He rushed the details. He used the wrong gauge of nails. He never understood that the strength of a structure is only as good as its weakest point. "Marcus, the moving trucks will be here at dawn," Sarah said. I could hear her footsteps moving away, echoing on the stone. "I'm going up to finish packing the jewelry. I want to be out of this zip code by noon. Make sure that lid is tight. I don't want to hear him scratching while I'm trying to sleep. It's morbid." "It's done," Marcus grumbled. I heard the hammer hit the floor. "He's gone, Sarah. The inheritance is finally ours. God knows I've earned it after putting up with his talk about dignity and his legacy for 40 years. I'm tired of living in a museum of his accomplishments. I want my own life. I heard his footsteps retreat. I heard the heavy iron door of the cellar groan shut, the bolt sliding into place with a finality that should have been the end of my story. Then silence, just the sound of my own shallow, panicked breathing, and the scent of cedar shavings.
I wish someone had told me that the hands you teach to hold a spoon are the same ones that will eventually hold the nails to your coffin. I wish someone had warned me that the blood you share is the same blood they're willing to spill for a piece of paper. If you've ever felt the person you gave a name to trying to erase yours, stay with me. Because the truth, much like a stubborn heart, is hard to bury. I used the only tool I had left, the strength of a man who has nothing left to lose but his silence. I braced my back against the bottom of the box and my knees against the lid. I didn't push with my muscles, I pushed with my soul. I pictured Marcus's face when he realized the bank accounts were empty. I pictured Sarah's face when the neighbors found out she was a murderer. The wood groaned. It was a beautiful, agonizing sound. One of Marcus's poorly placed nails shrieked as it gave way, the metal sliding out of the soft wood. I pushed again, the agony in my joints screaming, my vision swimming in the dark, until the lid cracked. Oxygen, stale, basement-scented oxygen, flooded in, and I breathed it like it was the finest wine I'd ever tasted. I climbed out of that box like a ghost rising from the earth. My suit was ruined, my hands were shredded, and my heart was a cold, dead weight in my chest. I stood in the flickering light of the single bulb in the cellar, staring at the coffin. It was a makeshift thing, built from the scraps of my old workshop, a final insult to a man who had built cathedrals of industry. On the floor beside it lay a manila folder Marcus must have dropped in his haste to leave the scene of the crime. I picked it up with trembling hands. It wasn't just a will. It wasn't just the medical records they'd faked. It was a contract for the immediate demolition of the house. He wasn't just selling my home. He was erasing the crime scene. He was going to pull the walls down on top of my grave. He was going to turn 40 years of memories into a pile of rubble and a parking lot. I realized then that I couldn't just walk out. If I walked out now, Marcus would see me. He'd finish what he started, and this time, he wouldn't be sloppy. I had to remain dead to stay alive. I had to become the phantom he already believed I was. I looked at the hammer Marcus had left on the workbench, the steel head glinting in the low light. I picked it up, the weight of the tool familiar and grounding. I wasn't just Arthur Vance anymore. I was a man who knew exactly how to dismantle what he had built. Arthur? Is that you? I heard the door at the top of the stairs creak open. It wasn't Marcus. It was the house. The house was speaking to me through the vents. But then, the heavy thud of footsteps returned. I watched from the shadows near the furnace as Marcus returned to the cellar an hour later. He probably couldn't sleep. He probably wanted to see the lid one last time, to convince himself he was a rich man now. He didn't see me. I was tucked into the darkness behind the water heater, holding my breath until my chest burned. He walked over to the box, a flashlight in his hand. The beam cut through the dark, landing on the broken lid. I saw his face. It didn't show remorse. It didn't show the grief of a son who had lost a father. It showed a terrifying, frantic hunger. He dropped the flashlight, the beam spinning on the floor, illuminating the empty velvet interior. "Where is he?" Marcus screamed into the emptiness. The sound echoed off the stone walls, high and frantic. "Dad, where are you? You can't be out! You're dead! You're supposed to be dead!" He began to tear at the boxes in the cellar, throwing Martha's old jars of preserves against the wall, the glass shattering like ice. He was losing his mind, the reality of his failure crashing down on him.
"You can't do this to me," Marcus yelled, his voice cracking. "I did everything right. I took the medicine. I called the doctor. You're not here. You're not real." I gripped the hammer in the dark, my knuckles white, watching the man I had raised look for the father he had tried to kill. He looked small. He looked weak. He looked like a structure built on sand, already starting to lean. I didn't step out. Not yet. I wanted him to live in this terror for a while. I wanted him to feel the walls closing in, even when the room was wide open. I watched him stumble back toward the stairs, his breathing coming in ragged, terrified gasps. "Sarah! Sarah! He's gone!" Marcus was sobbing as he ran up the stairs. "The box is empty! He's out! He's out!" I listened to the door slam. I listened to their muffled screams from the floor above. The sound of furniture being moved. The sound of locks being turned. They thought they were locking me out. They didn't realize they were locking themselves in, with a man who knew every secret passage and every hollow space in this foundation. I walked over to the workbench and picked up the flashlight Marcus had dropped.
I shone it on the folder. I read the words again. Demolition order, October 20th. That was only a few days away. They were in a hurry. They were desperate. And desperation is the crack in the concrete that allows the frost to get in. I looked at the hammer in my hand. It was a 16-ounce claw hammer, the first one I'd ever bought. It had built the rafters of this house. It had framed the windows where Marcus used to watch for me to come home from work. It was a tool of creation, but tonight it felt like a tool of reckoning. I didn't feel like a victim. I didn't feel like a dying old man. I felt like the architect of a very different kind of future. I walked to the corner of the cellar, where the old breaker box was hidden behind a wooden panel. I knew how to cut the power to the second floor without affecting the basement. I knew how to make the lights flicker just enough to make them think the house was haunted. I knew how to make the pipes groan like a man in pain. I was going to give them the memorial service they deserved, but it wouldn't be on their terms. I stood there in the dark, the weight of the house above me feeling like a second skin. Marcus and Sarah were up there, counting their stolen jewelry and looking over their shoulders, terrified of a ghost. They were right to be afraid, because I wasn't going to let them leave this house until they had confessed to every nail they'd driven into that box. I looked at the empty coffin one last time. It looked like a discarded shell. It looked like the past. I turned off the flashlight and let the darkness take me back. I knew every inch of this basement. I knew the crawl spaces that led into the walls. I knew where the shadows were deepest. The trucks might be coming at dawn, but I was the one who held the blueprints. I was the one who knew which load-bearing beams to strike. Marcus had the hammer in his hand when he thought he was winning, but I was the one who knew how to use it. I took a step toward the hidden stairs behind the furnace, my heart beating a steady, relentless rhythm. Arthur Vance was dead to the world, but he was very much alive in the bones of this house. I was going to show them that you can't just tear down a life and expect the rubble to stay silent. I reached out and touched the cold stone wall, feeling the vibration of their footsteps above me. They were running. They were hiding. They were waiting for the sun to come up so they could escape the crime they had committed. But the sun doesn't shine in the cellar, and I wasn't finished with the basement yet. I gripped the handle of the hammer, feeling the familiar grain of the wood against my palm. It was time to get to work. It was time to show them that some foundations are too deep to be destroyed, and some secrets are too heavy to be buried. I leaned into the darkness, a ghost in the house I built, listening to the sound of my own survival. I knew that the next time Marcus saw me, it wouldn't be in a box. It would be in his nightmares. A ghost doesn't need a key to enter his own house, and for 3 long, agonizing days, I lived in the hollow spaces between the walls I had designed with my own hands. There is a strange, cold irony in haunting a building that was meant to be your sanctuary, watching your own life being dismantled through the slats of a ventilation grate. I crouched in the attic crawl space, the insulation stinging my skin like 1,000 needles, and I listened. I listened to the house breathe, and I listened to the monsters who thought they had finally silenced its creator. I watched Marcus and Sarah from above, peering through the copper vents as they stood in the center of my study, the room where I had once helped Marcus with his geometry homework. They weren't mourning, they were toasting. Marcus held a glass of my 1945 vintage cognac, swirling the amber liquid with a smug grin that made my stomach churn. "To the new era," Marcus said, his voice echoing up to my hiding place. Sarah laughed, a sharp tinkling sound that felt like glass shards under my skin. She was holding Martha's wedding ring, turning it over in the light. "I can't believe he kept this hidden in that old desk. It's easily 6 carats. I'm going to have it reset into a necklace, Marcus. The ring is so—" "Do whatever you want with it, Sarah," Marcus replied, taking a heavy swallow of the cognac. "The jeweler is coming tomorrow to appraise the rest of the collection. Once the demolition crew levels this place on Friday, there won't be a trace of the Vance legacy left." Sarah asked, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I gave them the performance of a lifetime this morning," Marcus sneered. "I told them he'd been talking about going to the river for weeks. I even dropped one of his old hats near the trailhead. They're dragging the water now." I gripped the wooden joist until my knuckles turned white.
My own son had calculated my death down to the placement of a hat. The gaslighting was a masterpiece, a structure of lies built on the foundation of my supposed senility. But they didn't know I was holding a weapon of my own. Tucked into the pocket of my dusty suit was the old dictaphone I used to keep for my architectural notes. I had recorded every word of their toast, every cruel laugh, every admission of their crime. I needed an ally, and there was only one man in this city who knew the difference between a lie and a layout: Frank Miller. We had spent 30 years sitting on the same green bench in the park, trading chess moves and stories about the war. Frank was a retired detective, a man who could smell a forged document from a mile away. I waited until the house was silent, until the rhythmic snoring of the betrayers drifted up from the master bedroom, and I crept out through the garage. I found the burner phone I'd hidden inside a hollowed-out birdhouse years ago, a remnant of a paranoid streak I'd had during a difficult contract dispute. My hands shook as I dialed the number. "Frank," I whispered when he picked up on the 3rd ring. There was a silence so long I thought the line had gone dead. Then a sharp intake of breath. "Arthur, my God, man, I'm looking at the news right now. They say you're—" "I didn't fall, Frank," I said, my voice sounding like gravel being crushed under a heavy boot. "I was pushed, and then I was nailed down into a cedar box in my own basement. I'm a ghost now, Frank, but I'm a ghost with a recording. I need you to meet me at the old lumber yard, the one on 4th Street. Bring a lawyer you trust. Arthur, if this is a joke, I've never been less in the mood for a joke in my life." I cut him through. "Meet me in 1 hour, and Frank, don't tell a soul you've talked to me, not even the precinct." We met in the skeletal remains of the warehouse where I had started Vance construction 50 years ago. The air was thick with the scent of sawdust and old mummeries. Frank looked at me, covered in gray attic dust, my suit torn, my eyes hollow with the waking nightmare of the burial, and he didn't offer me pity. He stood straight, his eyes turning into the flinty marbles of the detective he used to be. "You look like you've crawled out of hell, Arthur," Frank said, stepping into the circle of my flashlight's beam. "I did," I replied, sliding the dictaphone across a stack of plywood. "I crawled out of a coffin my son built for me. Listen to this, Frank." Frank listened to the recording in silence. Beside him, a young, sharp-eyed lawyer named Miller, Frank's nephew, took notes with a furious intensity. When the recording ended with Sarah's laugh about Martha's ring, Frank looked up, and I saw a flicker of the old fire in his gaze.
"This is enough to pull them in for questioning, Arthur," Frank said. "But Marcus is smart. He'll claim the recording was doctored, or that you were playing a game." "He's holding a memorial service tomorrow morning," I said, the plan forming in my mind with the cold precision of a blueprint. "He's doing it on the front lawn, right before the demolition crews arrive at noon. He wants the community to see his grief before he flattens the evidence of the cellar vault. He thinks he's burying a nobody." Miller, the lawyer, leaned forward. "Arthur, we can stop the demolition legally tonight." "No," I said, slamming my hand onto the plywood. "If we stop it now, he'll have time to hide. He'll frame Sarah, or he'll run with the offshore accounts. I want him at that podium. I want him to look every person he's lied to in the eye and tell them how much he loves his late father." Frank sighed, rubbing his jaw. "It's a hell of a risk." "He won't," I said. "He thinks the house is empty. He's already moved his things to a hotel to avoid the pain of the demolition. I'll be waiting inside. I designed that house, Frank. I know every shadow." "There's something else," Miller said, sliding a manila file across the table. "Frank asked me to dig into the recent filings at the insurance bureau. It's not just the house and the estate, Arthur. Marcus took out a life insurance policy on you 6 months ago. A big one. $2 million. The words hit me like a physical blow to the solar plexus. "For accidental death," Frank repeated, his voice grim. "Like falling into a river, or a tragic accident during a house demolition. He didn't just want the inheritance, Arthur. He wanted a bonus for your murder." I sat back on a crate, the darkness of the warehouse closing in. I thought about the times I'd sat on the porch with Marcus, showing him how to use a level, teaching him that a man's word had to be as straight as his lines. I had poured my life into him, and he had used that life as collateral for a payday.
The PTSD of the coffin, the weight of the lid, the sound of the hammer, flashed back for a second, making the room spin. I gripped the edge of the plywood until the wood splintered into my palm. "Tomorrow," I said, my voice cold and lethal. The morning of the memorial was a masterpiece of atmospheric gloom. A gray mist clung to the oak trees like a shroud, and a fine, freezing drizzle turned the front lawn into a muddy stage. From the second-story window of the neighbor's house, where Frank had helped me hide in the early hours, I watched the mourners arrive. It was a sea of black umbrellas. People I had known for decades, friends from the architecture board, former employees, neighbors, all stood there, offering their fake sympathies to Marcus. Marcus stood at the podium on the front steps, wearing a black armband and a handkerchief tucked into his sleeve. He looked the part of the grieving son perfectly. Sarah stood beside him, her face a mask of tragic, pale beauty, leaning against him for support. "He was a great man," I heard Sarah tell a reporter from the local news station near the hedge. "But his mind, it just slipped away at the end. We did everything we could to keep him safe, to keep him in the home he loved." I watched the news camera zoom in on her fake tears. The bile rose in my throat. I signaled Frank, who was standing near the back of the crowd with his hand on his phone. It was time. I moved through the house I had built, my footsteps silent on the mahogany floors. I stood behind the grand balcony doors on the second floor, looking down at the top of Marcus's head as he stepped up to the microphone. "My father was a builder," Marcus began, his voice cracking with a practiced sob. "He believed in foundations. He believed in things that lasted." "The legacy isn't finished yet, Marcus," I said. I didn't need a microphone. I just pushed open the French doors and stepped out onto the balcony. The sound that came from the crowd wasn't a gasp. It was a collective intake of breath that sounded like a windstorm through the oaks. Women shrieked. A man in the front row dropped his umbrella. Sarah turned, looked up at me, and her eyes rolled back into her head as she fainted dead away onto the wet grass. Marcus froze. He looked like a man who had seen a hole open up in the earth. The paper in his hand fluttered to the mud, forgotten. He looked up at me, and for the first time in his life, I saw the terror of a child who finally realizes the dark is real and that it has teeth. You, he stammered, his voice thin and high, echoing through the stunned silence. "You're supposed to be the river." "The river was a lie, Marcus," I said, stepping to the edge of the railing. I looked down at him, my gaze as heavy as a lead weight. "Just like the heart failure you told the doctor about. Just like the cedar box you nailed shut in the basement vault. You always were a sloppy builder, Marcus. You forgot that I designed this house to breathe." Frank stepped forward from the crowd, flanked by 2 uniformed officers and the district attorney. He didn't say a word. He just held up the dictaphone. He held up the manila file with the double indemnity insurance policy. "Marcus Vance," Frank's voice boomed over the lawn, "you are under arrest for attempted murder, insurance fraud, and felony elder abuse. Don't make a scene." Marcus didn't try to fight. He looked at the news crew, who had swung their lenses up toward me on the balcony, then back to the police. He turned toward the demolition bulldozer that was idling at the edge of the property, its yellow paint a garish contrast to the funeral black of the crowd. He looked for an escape, but the driver stepped out. It was Frank's nephew, Miller. There was nowhere left to hide. Marcus collapsed on the lawn, the same lawn where he had played with toy trucks while I built the porch. He began to wail, a high, thin sound that wasn't a cry of regret. It was the sound of a predator who had finally been snared by his own greed.
Sarah was led away in a separate cruiser, her expensive dress torn and stained with mud, her philanthropy revealed as a blood-soaked sham for the world to see. The aftermath was a slow, quiet healing. I didn't demolish the house. I tore up the contract and fired the crew. I spent the next 6 months turning the mansion into a sanctuary, a place for others who had been cast aside by their families, a foundation for those who had nowhere else to stand. I sat on the porch that evening, the heavy steel hammer resting on the table beside me. The gray mist of the morning had cleared, and the stars were sharp and bright, looking down on the city I had helped build. My body was old, and my heart was tired from the weight of the betrayal, but my dignity had been restored from the grave. I reached out and ran my hand over the handle of the tool, feeling the familiar grain of the wood. The hammer was in my hand now, but I wasn't using it to nail anything shut. I was using it to build a cage for the monsters, making sure that the truth would never be buried again.
Justice had been served in the very house where the crime was conceived, and for the first time in a very long time, I could finally take a deep breath of the night air. I closed my eyes and listened to the silence, and I knew that the foundation was finally level.